There is a history that was never meant to be remembered. Millions of people torn from their homes, chained and loaded onto ships, many never surviving the crossing. Those who did were stripped of their names, their language, their identity, told generation after generation that they were nothing. And out of that pain came a word so loaded with blood and history that it still cuts deep today. This is not easy to hear, but it needs to be told.
Like, subscribe, drop a comment wherever you are watching from. Let's begin.
Before we talk about what was done, we need to talk about who it was done to, because the story of slavery has been told for so long, starting with the chains, that most people have forgotten to ask the most important question of all. What was there before? And the answer is so far, so completely, so deliberately removed from what most people were taught that I want to sit with it for an entire chapter, because they were not taken from nothing. They were taken from something, from kingdoms, from universities, from courts, and armies, and trade routes, and art, and medicine, and mathematics, and music, and law, and everything that the word civilization has ever meant. The richest man who ever lived, because I want to begin with a man, not a symbol, not a representation of African civilization in the abstract, a specific man with a specific name and a specific story that most history classes in most schools in most countries or else have never told. His name was Mansa Musa. He was the emperor of the Mali Empire in West Africa. He ruled from 1312 to 1337, and he was, by the most careful, most rigorous, most serious historical and economic analysis available, the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. Not the wealthiest in his time, not the wealthiest in African history, the wealthiest in all of recorded human history. Jeff Bezos, at his peak, was worth approximately $117 billion. Mansa Musa's wealth has been estimated at the equivalent of $400 billion, and his source of wealth was not technology, not finance, not oil, gold and salt, and the control of the most important trade routes in the ancient world, the Hajj that broke the economy of Egypt, because the most extraordinary single story about Mansa Musa is not about his wealth. It is about what he did with it. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, required of every Muslim who is able to make it. But Mansa Musa did not make the Hajj quietly. He travelled with an entourage of 60,000 people, including 12,000 personal servants, all dressed in silk and brocade, 500 heralds, each carrying a gold staff, and, reportedly, 18 tons of gold. En route, he passed through Cairo, and he gave away so much gold, so generously, so continuously, to the poor, to merchants, to rulers, to anyone who crossed his path, that he caused a gold inflation crisis in Egypt that lasted for a decade. One man passing through on a pilgrimage crashed the Egyptian economy for 10 years by being too generous. The university in Timbuktu, because Mansa Musa was not just extraordinarily wealthy, he was extraordinarily intellectually ambitious. He recruited scholars from the wider Muslim world to travel to Mali, such as the Andalusian poet Abu Ishaq al-Sahili and helped establish Timbuktu as a centre of Islamic learning. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu was restaffed under Musa's reign with jurists, astronomers and mathematicians. 25,000 students, 1 million manuscripts in Timbuktu in the 14th century, while Europe was still in the Middle Ages, while the Black Death was sweeping across the continent to the north, while most European cities were struggling to maintain basic civic order and sanitation and food supply. There was a university in West Africa with 25,000 students and 1 million manuscripts. And most people in the world today have never been taught this, the Mali Empire at its height, because the university was not the only extraordinary thing about the Mali Empire. 400 cities, an empire so large that Mansa Musa himself reportedly said it would take a year to travel from one end to the other. It encompassed parts of what are now Mali, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso. One of the largest, most sophisticated, most wealthy empires on earth, at a time when most European kingdoms were, by comparison, small, right, poor, and fractious. The Kingdom of Benin and the Bronzes, because the Mali Empire was not the only extraordinary civilization in West Africa before the slave trade. The Kingdom of Benin, in what is now southern Nigeria, was producing art of such extraordinary technical sophistication that when European explorers first encountered it in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans had made it. The Benin bronzes, intricate, technically precise, historically detailed sculptures in brass and bronze depicting kings and warriors, ceremonies and battles, the entire living, breathing, recorded history of a civilization cast in metal. When British forces raided the Kingdom of Benin in 1897, they looted thousands of these bronzes and sent them to museums across Europe, where they inspired some of the most famous European artists of the 20th century: Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Henry Moore, all of them drawing inspiration from the art of a civilization whose existence the colonial world had spent decades trying to deny: the Songhai Empire and Timbuktu. Because after the Mali Empire came something even larger, the Songhai Empire, rising from the 15th century to dominate West Africa. At the height of the transatlantic slave trade, Timbuktu, under the Songhai, remained what it had become under Mansa Musa, one of the great intellectual centres of the world. Scholars came from across Africa, from the Arab world, from as far away as Spain, to study in Timbuktu, not because they were invited to teach, because they came to learn what was deliberately erased, because here is the thing that I want to sit with before we leave this chapter. The erasure of this history was not accidental. It was deliberate. The ideology that justified the enslavement of African people required the belief that African people had no civilization worth preserving, no history worth recording, no culture worth protecting, no humanity worth respecting. Because if you knew about Mansa Musa and the 25,000 students and the 1,000,000 manuscript, and the 400 cities, and the Benin bronzes, and the trade routes, and the astronomers, and the mathematicians, and the lawyers, and the architects, and the musicians, and the poets, and the kings, and the queens, and the empires, that stretched across half a continent at the same time that Europe was emerging from the Middle Ages. If you knew all of that, the lie that justified the chains would not have been possible. So the history was erased systematically over generations, in schools, in books, in the language as used to describe the people being enslaved. They erased the history because they needed the people to be from nothing. They were not from nothing. The first contact and what it started, because it is important to understand how this transition happened. From the kingdoms to the chains, it was not overnight. The Portuguese arrived on the West African coast in the 15th century, initially looking for gold, looking for trade routes, looking for a way to bypass the Arab merchants who controlled the Saharan trade routes and reach the source of the extraordinary wealth that Mansa Musa's Hajj had announced to the world. And what they found when they arrived was not a primitive continent waiting to be civilized. It was a continent of extraordinary sophistication with its own complex power structures, its own existing slave trade between African kingdoms, its own economic systems that the Europeans initially simply joined, and then, over decades, over generations, over centuries, expanded into something that nobody who was there at the beginning fully understood they were creating. The African kings who sold people, because this chapter would not be honest if it did not sit with something that is genuinely uncomfortable. The transatlantic slave trade was not simply a story of Europeans raiding African villages. African kings sold people to European traders. African kingdoms went to war with neighbouring kingdoms, specifically to capture people, to sell. This is true, and it must be said, honestly. But context matters enormously. The institution of slavery that existed within Africa before the transatlantic trade was fundamentally different from what the Europeans built. Enslaved people within African societies could own property, could marry, could eventually be freed. Their children were not automatically enslaved. What the Europeans built was something entirely different. Hereditary, racial, permanent, designed to last forever. And the African kings who sold people to European traders did not know they were selling them into that. Not at first. What the people carried was with them. Because before we go to the ship, before we go to the water, I want to leave this chapter with something that I find the most important single detail in the entire story. The people who were captured and marched to the coast and put on ships carried something with them. Not gold, not manuscripts, not bronze. Something that no chain could carry. Something that no ship could contain. Something that no system of slavery, however carefully, however deliberately, however comprehensively designed, could take. They carried the memory of who they were, the music, the language, in fragments, the stories, the rhythms, the relationship with the divine, the understanding of community and family and dignity that no chain had ever been able to fully remove from any people who carried it deeply enough. They carried it through the door, onto the ship, across the water, into the plantation, and it survived. Let the kingdoms settle into the history they actually occupied. Mansa Musa and his 400 billion. The 25,000 students in Timbuktu, the million manuscripts, the Benin bronzes inspiring Picasso a century after they were stolen. All of it real. All of it before. All of it deliberately erased. How it started. The Portuguese and the door of no return. 1441, a Portuguese captain returning to Lisbon with 12 African people as gifts for the prince. The moment the machine began, and the door on Gorée Island, that became the last thing 12.5 million people would ever see of home, but only when you need it. The kingdoms are behind us, the door is ahead, and the ocean is waiting.
There is a moment in every catastrophe where it could still have gone differently. A decision not yet made. A door not yet opened. A ship not yet loaded. For the transatlantic slave trade, that moment was 1441, and the man standing in it was a young Portuguese captain named Antão Gonçalves. He had been sent to the West African coast to collect seal skins and seal oil. That was the mission. That was all he had been asked to do. He collected his cargo, and then he made a different decision. He called a meeting of the 21 sailors who accompanied him. He unveiled a plan to increase their profits. He suggested they go ashore and capture some of the people they could see on the coast. They did. They returned to Portugal with 12 African people as gifts for Prince Henry the Navigator. And the machine had started. What happened next moved fast, because once the first profit had been made, once the first people had been successfully transported and sold, the logic of commerce took over. By 1444, just 3 years later, a Portuguese merchant named Lancerote de Freitas led an expedition that returned to Lagos in southern Portugal with 235 enslaved Africans, the first large-scale public sale of enslaved people in European history. By 1460, 700 to 800 African people were being taken into Portugal annually. By 1500, approximately 50,000 people had been removed from Africa, and the system was still just getting started. The Pope and the blessing. Because here is something that most people have never been told about the transatlantic slave trade. It was blessed by the Catholic Church. Not tolerated, not ignored, blessed. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a document called Dum Diversus, a papal bull, an official, authoritative, religious declaration from the head of the Catholic Church. It authorised the King of Portugal to, and these are the words, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate their possessions and property. Perpetual slavery, authorised by the Pope. In 1452, the Church that preached "Love thy neighbour" officially authorised the permanent enslavement of human beings in the name of God. The triangular trade and how it worked, because the slave trade was not simply a matter of ships going to Africa and taking people. It was a system, an extraordinarily profitable, carefully engineered commercial system that involved 3 continents and made vast fortunes for those who ran it. Europe sent ships loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, metals, guns, to the West African coast. Those goods were traded for enslaved people, either purchased from African kings and traders who had captured people from neighbouring territories, or taken directly by force in raids on coastal villages. The enslaved people were then loaded onto the ships and taken across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they were sold to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, rice. The profits from those sales and from the goods those plantations produced were taken back to Europe to fund the next voyage, and the next, and the next. The triangle turning for 366 years.
The door of no return, because we established in the introduction that there is a door on Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal, at the end of a long, dark stone corridor in a building called the House of Slaves. Standing at that door, today you look out directly onto the Atlantic Ocean, the water, grey, vast, completely indifferent to everything that happened at its edge. The building that surrounds the door tells the story of what happened before the door was reached. 8 square feet, 30 men, 1 small window, 1 meal per day, and then the door. What the door meant, because the door of no return was not just a door. It was the last moment of certainty, the last moment when a person still stood on the ground of the continent where they were born, where their family had lived for generations, where their language, their tradition, their understanding of who they were had been formed. On one side of the door was everything: name, language, family, history, identity, home. On the other side was the water, and a ship, and a destination they had never heard of, among people who did not speak their language, who did not know their name, who did not consider them fully human. The door was the last moment before all of that, and they called it the door of no return, because for almost everyone who walked through it, that was exactly what it was. The march to the coast, because the door of no return was not the beginning of the ordeal. For most people who passed through it, it was already the end of an ordeal that had begun hundreds of miles inland, when African kingdoms went to war with their neighbours to capture people to sell. The captured were marched to the coast on foot, in chains, through terrain that was often hundreds of miles of jungle and savanna and heat. Those who could not keep up were killed or left behind to die. The march itself killed an unknown number of people before they ever reached the coast, and when they arrived at the coast, at the fort, at the holding cell, they had already survived something. That many had not, and then the cell, and then the waiting, and then the door, and then the ship. The first enslaved Africans in England, because the slave trade was not only a Portuguese story. England entered the trade in 1562, when a privateer named John Hawkins sailed to Sierra Leone, captured or purchased around 300 African people and transported them to the Caribbean, where he sold them to Spanish colonists in what is now Venezuela. Queen Elizabeth I, who had initially expressed disapproval of the venture, describing it as detestable and calling down vengeance from heaven upon those who practice it, subsequently became one of Hawkins's investors. The profit was too significant to maintain the moral objection. Within a century, Britain would become the dominant power in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic than any other nation. The numbers in full, because the numbers of the transatlantic slave trade deserve to be stated clearly, completely, without the distancing that numbers sometimes provide when they are large enough to become abstract. 12.5 million people put on ships against their will, 366 years, approximately 1.8 million died during the crossing. That is, 1 in every 7 people who was loaded onto a ship did not survive to see the other side, and millions more died during the march to the coast, in the holding cells, in the first years on the plantation, from the violence and the disease and the destruction of everything that had sustained them. The number of people who died as a direct consequence of the transatlantic slave traders is impossible to calculate fully. What we know is that it was in the millions. Let that sit. The ships were followed by sharks, because enough people were thrown or fell or jumped overboard that the sharks learned to follow. The ocean between Africa and the Americas is a graveyard for an unknown, but certainly enormous, number of human beings, whose names we do not know, whose families we cannot trace, whose stories went to the bottom of the Atlantic with them. What made it possible to do this to people? Because here is the question that I think is the most important in the entire chapter. How? How did human beings do this to other human beings for 366 years? How did the captain of a slave ship go home to his family at the end of a voyage? How did the investor in London or Lisbon or Amsterdam count his profits and sleep at night? The answer is the same answer to every atrocity in human history. They convinced themselves that the people they were doing it to were not fully people. The ideology of racial hierarchy was not the cause of the slave trade. It was the justification for it, built after the fact, to make what was already happening feel acceptable. The science was fabricated. The religion was bent to serve the purpose. The law was written to confirm what the economics required. And the word that was used to name the people being enslaved was engineered specifically to make the distance between them and their enslavers feel permanent. That word is chapter 5, the Olaudah Equiano testimony, because before we leave this chapter, I want to give a voice to someone who was there. Olaudah Equiano was born in what is now Nigeria around 1745. He was captured as a child and taken across the Atlantic. He eventually bought his own freedom, became a sailor, an abolitionist, and a writer. And he left behind one of the most important documents in the history of the slave trade, his autobiography, published in 1789. He described arriving at the coast as a child and seeing, for the first time, the ocean and the ship. He wrote, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor, waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror, which I am yet at a loss to describe. Terror, which I am yet at a loss to describe. A child, looking at the ocean for the first time, and a ship, waiting for its cargo, and the cargo was him." Let the ocean settle into the weight of what it carried. The door opened in 1441 and did not close until 1867. 12.5 million people, 366 years, the sharks following the ships, and a child on the coast, filled with terror which he was yet at a loss to describe. The middle passage, the ship. We go onto the water, inside the hold, into the specific, documented, devastating detail of what the crossing actually was, not the abstraction of 12.5 million, the specific human reality of one ship with 400 people packed into a space not designed for 400 people crossing for 80 days on water that did not care whether they lived or died, but only when you need it. The door is behind us, the ship is ahead, and the water is waiting. I want to tell you exactly what it was like, not the abstraction of 12.5 million people, not the number that is large enough to become impossible to hold in the mind. I want to tell you about the ship, about the hold, about the specific, documented, measured, actual dimensions of the space that a human being was given for a crossing that lasted, on average, 80 days, because the number 12.5 million is almost impossible to feel. But a space 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and 3 feet high is something you can feel right now in the room where you're lying. 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, 3 feet high, for 80 days. What 16 inches means, because I want to make sure that number is real before we go any further. 16 inches is the width of a standard kitchen chopping board. It is roughly the distance from your shoulder to your elbow. It is not enough space to lie on your back with your arms at your sides, not comfortably, not in any way that a human being was designed to rest and chained to the person on either side of you. Right wrist to their left wrist, right ankle to their left ankle, so that if they turned, you turned with them. If they were sick, you were sick with them. If they died, you lay chained to them until someone came, which, in the darkness of the hold, might not be for a very long time. The hold described because Olaudah Equiano, who survived the Middle Passage and who we met in Chapter 2, described what he found when he was carried below decks for the first time. He wrote the closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. The hold of a slave ship was not designed for human beings. It was designed for cargo, for goods, for the kind of objects that do not need air or water or dignity to survive the crossing. The platforms on which people lay were described by one ship's surgeon as strips of unplaned boards with no covering to protect people from the splinters and knots placed nearly midway between the decks at a distance of 2 to 3 feet from each deck. Unplaned boards, splinters, knots in 16 inches of space for 80 days. The smell, because the ship had another dimension beyond the space, beyond the chains, beyond the darkness that the written accounts return to again and again. The smell. Dr. Alexander Falconbridge, who served as a surgeon aboard several slave ships in the late 1700s and who later became an abolitionist, wrote about what he witnessed with the clinical precision of a medical professional trying to describe something that he could not fully put into words. He wrote, the deck, that is the floor, of their rooms was so covered with the blood and mucus which had proceeded from them in consequence of the flux that it resembled a slaughterhouse. It is not in the power of the human imagination to picture a situation more dreadful or disgusting. A slaughterhouse, written by a ship's surgeon, as the most accurate description he could find for what the floor of the hold looked like after weeks at sea. The crew, and what it cost them, because the Middle Passage was not without cost to the people running it. The sailors who crewed the slave ships were often, themselves, poorly paid, brutally treated, and frequently cheated out of their wages. On return, 20%. 1 in 5 sailors did not survive a slave voyage. They slept on the open deck in all weather because the space below was occupied by the people they were transporting, and the captains had a specific, cynical, economic reason for tolerating the high crew mortality on the return voyage. Dead sailors did not have to be paid. The cruelty of the system extended in every direction. The Zong and the insurance claim, because there is one story from the Middle Passage that I want to tell before this chapter closes, because it says, more clearly than anything else, what the system considered the people it was transporting to be. In 1781, a British slave ship called the Zong was crossing from West Africa to Jamaica. The crossing had taken longer than expected. Disease had broken out in the hold. The water supplies were running low, and the captain, Luke Collingwood, made a calculation. If enslaved people died of disease on the ship, the loss fell on the ship's owners. But if they were thrown overboard at sea, the loss could be claimed on the ship's insurance. As jettisoned cargo, Captain Collingwood ordered 132 enslaved people to be thrown into the Atlantic Ocean alive, and then he filed an insurance claim. The case went to court in London, not as a murder trial, as an insurance dispute, whether the owners were entitled to claim for their lost cargo. 132 people thrown into the ocean alive, disputed as a matter of insurance law what the crossing produced in those who survived. Because the Middle Passage was not just a journey, it was a deliberate systematic, comprehensive attempt to destroy the person who boarded the ship in Africa before they arrived in the Americas. The name taken, the language separated, people from the same community were deliberately placed on different ships or separated within the same ship to prevent communication and organisation. The family already gone before the ship left, the history cut off at the coast, the continent visible until it was not. By the time a person arrived on the other side, they were supposed to be someone different, someone who did not know where they came from, who did not share a language with those beside them, who did not have the community or the histories or the identity that had sustained them before the ship. That was the point. Break them on the water so that what arrives on the other side is easier to control. What survived? Anyway, because here is what the system did not count on. The music survived. In the hold, in the chains, in 16 inches of space, people sang, not because they were told to. Sometimes they were. Crew members would force enslaved people to sing and dance on the deck for exercise, to keep the cargo functional. The singing, done under compulsion, noted in ship logs as a health measure, but there was also singing that was not compelled, singing in the hold, in the dark, that the crew could hear, coming up from below decks. The rhythms, the call and response, the specific, irreducible, untakeable, musical traditions of West Africa, surviving in 16 inches of space on the Atlantic Ocean. And when those people arrived in the Americas and were put to work on the plantation, the music came with them, and eventually it became the foundation of almost every significant musical tradition that America would produce. The blues, jazz, gospel, soul, hip-hop, all of it rooted in what survived the crossing. Let the ocean settle into the weight of what moved across it, 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, 3 feet high, 80 days, fixed melancholy, written in the ship's log, between the fever cases, 132 people thrown into the ocean as jettisoned cargo, disputed as an insurance claim, and the music surviving in the hold, in the dark, in 16 inches on the Atlantic, on the way to the plantation. The architecture of slavery, how it was built to last. The legal system, constructed specifically to make slavery permanent. The deliberate destruction of names and families and language. The slave codes, the partus rule, the specific, documented machinery of a system designed not just to enslave people, but to make sure they could never be anything else, but only when you need it. The ship is behind us, the plantation is ahead, and the architecture of what was built there is waiting to be examined. Slavery in America was not accidental. It was not informal. It was not a byproduct of economic necessity that simply happened without anyone sitting down and deliberately constructing it. It was an architecture, a legal, systematic, carefully engineered, deliberately constructed system, built statute by statute, law by law, colony by colony, to be as permanent as anything human beings have ever built, and to understand what was done to black people in America, you need to understand not just the violence, not just the chains, not just the ship, but the paper, the laws that made it all legal, the beginning of the legal system. Because the legal architecture of American slavery did not arrive fully formed with the first enslaved Africans who reached Virginia in 1619. In the early years, the legal status of African people in the colonies was actually ambiguous. Some of the first Africans to arrive in Virginia were treated as indentured servants, people who would work for a fixed period and then be free. Some of them did become free. Some of them acquired land. Some of them even owned indentured servants themselves. But as the colonies grew more dependent on forced labour, as the profits from tobacco and sugar and cotton became too significant to risk the ambiguity, a decision was made. The ambiguity needed to end, and the laws that ended it were among the most consequential ever written in American history. The Partus Rule, 1662. Because the single most important, single most consequential, single most deliberately cruel legal decision in the architecture of American slavery was made in Virginia in 1662, and it was 12 words. All children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. 12 words. That created a self-perpetuating, self-funding, automatically expanding system of slavery that required No further imports, no further ships, no further middle passages to sustain itself indefinitely. The legal doctrine was called partus sequitur ventrum, Latin for offspring follows the womb, regardless of the father's status. This was deliberate. Children born of rape became property of the rapist, written into law in 1662, what the slave code said, because the partus rule was not the only law in the architecture. The slave codes, the comprehensive, detailed, exhaustive body of law that governed every aspect of enslaved people's lives, were among the most extraordinary legal documents ever produced by a democratic society. Let me read you what they said. Cannot testify in court, cannot make a contract, cannot own property, cannot strike a white person, even in self-defense, cannot leave without permission, cannot gather without a white person present, cannot own firearms, cannot read, cannot write, cannot marry, not suggestions, not social norms, laws, enforceable, with violence. The anti-literacy laws, and why they existed, because the prohibition on reading and writing deserves its own moment, because it is the most revealing single element of the entire architecture. Why would you make it illegal for a person to read? The answer tells you everything about what the system was actually afraid of. The myth. White supremacy was a myth, and the people who built the architecture of slavery knew it was a myth, because if they genuinely believed that black people were inferior, they would not have needed a law to prevent them from reading. You do not make it illegal for an inferior being to read. You make it illegal for a dangerous one, a capable one whose reading threatens the system built to contain them. The penalties for reading, because the anti-literacy laws were not abstract prohibitions. They had specific, documented, enforced penalties. A 19th century Virginia law specified any assemblage of Negroes for the purpose of instruction in reading or writing, or in the night time for any purpose, shall be an unlawful assembly. Any justice may issue his warrant, requiring him to enter any place where such assemblage may be, and seize any Negro therein, and he may order such Negro to be punished with stripes. Punished with stripes. Whipped for learning to read. M.E. Bishop William Henry Hurd remembered from his enslaved childhood in Georgia that any slave caught writing suffered the penalty of having his forefinger cut from his right hand, his forefinger cut off for writing, and the teachers of enslaved people were also prosecuted. Mississippi state law required a white person to serve up to a year in prison as penalty for teaching a slave to read. Amazon, a year in prison for teaching a human being to read. And yet, people learned anyway, in secret, at night, at great personal risk. They passed the knowledge from person to person in the dark, the way they passed everything that mattered, the destruction of the family, because beyond the slave codes, beyond the partus rule, beyond the anti-literacy laws, there was something more intimate, more devastating, more irreplaceable, that the system systematically destroyed. The family, enslaved people, could not legally marry. The slave codes did not recognize the marriages of enslaved people as having any legal validity, which meant that a husband and a wife could be sold to different owners at any time, without legal recourse, without the right to object, without any protection from the law that any other married couple could invoke, and children could be sold away from their mothers, their fathers, their siblings, at any age, at any time, for any reason, or no reason at all, because they were, under the law, property, and property does not have a family. The destruction of the name, because the families was not the only thing systematically destroyed. The name was taken too. When a person arrived on the plantation, they were given a new name, not their name, a name chosen by the person who now owned them. Sometimes a first name only, no family name, no surname, no connection through the name to any ancestor, any tradition, any lineage, any history that preceded the plantation, or the surname of the owner, so that a person carried through their name not the identity of their people, but the name of the man who owned them. This is why many black Americans, after emancipation, changed their names or chose new ones, because the name they had been given was not theirs. It was the plantations, it was the owners, it was the systems given to mark them as property, not as people. The destruction of the language, because the name was not the only linguistic target. The African languages that people brought from their home continent were actively suppressed. People from the same linguistic community were separated deliberately on the plantation to prevent communication in their original language, which could lead to organization, to resistance, to the kind of community that the system needed to prevent the deliberate separation of people who shared a language meant that the languages of West Africa could not survive intact on the plantation. But they did not disappear entirely. They transformed into something new, a Creole, a fusion, a language, born in the gap between what was taken and what survived, carrying in its rhythms and its syntax and its music the ghost of every language that had been suppressed but never fully silenced, the killing of enslaved people and the law, because here is the most revealing single legal provision in the entire slave code, the provision about killing. A Virginia slave code from October 1669 addressed the killing of slaves this way, whereas the only law in force for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, nor the obstinacy of many of them be suppressed by other than violent means, be it enacted and declared by this Grand Assembly, if any slave resists his master, and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be accounted a felony, but the master be acquitted from molestation, since it cannot be presumed that premeditated malice, which alone makes murder a felony, should induce any man to destroy his own estate, if a master beat an enslaved person to death in the course of punishing them. It was not murder, because the law reasoned no man would deliberately destroy his own property, a human being beaten to death, not a murder, because the victim was someone's estate, what the architecture produced, because the slave codes and the Partus rule and the anti-literacy laws and the prohibition on marriage and the destruction of names and the separation of languages and the legal permission to beat people to death without consequence produced something very specific. They produced a system that was, by design, self-perpetuating, self-funding, automatically expanding, and, in theory, permanent. Every child born to an enslaved mother was automatically enslaved, automatically additional property, automatically another worker for the plantation that had created them, and they would never, by law, be able to read the document that defined their status, never be able to testify against the person who owned them, never be able to marry the person they loved, never be able to give their child their name. The architecture was complete, comprehensive, deliberate, and built to last. What was built anyway? Because the architecture was comprehensive, and the resistance was equally comprehensive. People who could not legally marry be married anyway, in ceremonies of their own making, jumping the broom, the ritual that became the symbol of commitment between people whom the law refused to recognize as capable of commitment. People who could not legally read taught themselves and each other to read at night, in secret, at the risk of their fingers. People whose names were taken gave their children secret names, names that only the family knew, names from the original languages, names that the plantation never recorded in its ledgers. The architecture tried to build a world in which certain people could never be fully human, and those people built their humanity anyway, in the gaps, in the dark, in the secret ceremonies, in the night schools, in the names that only the family knew. Let the architecture settle into the weight of what it built. The Partus rule, the slave codes, cannot testify, cannot own property, cannot read, cannot write, cannot marry, cannot be murdered, because property cannot be murdered. And in the gaps, the secret ceremonies, the night schools, the names, the plantation never knew the word, the full history of the most charged, most weaponized, most complex word in the English language, from a neutral Latin adjective meaning black, to the atomic bomb of racial slurs, to the extraordinary act of reclamation that made it, simultaneously, the most dangerous word in English and a word of fraternity. Within the community, it was used to destroy, but only when you need it. The architecture is behind us. The word is ahead, and its history is 500 years long. There is a word in the English language that Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy, who wrote an entire book about its history called The Nuclear Bomb of Racial Epithets. Not the most offensive word, not one of the worst words. The nuclear bomb, the most uniquely, most specifically, most historically loaded word in the English language. Tonight, we are going to look at where it came from, what it became, what it was used to do, and what happened when the people it was used against decided to take it back. This chapter will use the word in its historical context. Not casually, not carelessly, with the full weight of everything it carries. Because to understand what was done to black identity in America, you have to understand this word, what it was designed to do, how it was designed to do it, and why the story of its reclamation is one of the most extraordinary acts of linguistic resistance in human history, where it began, because the word begins in the most innocent, most neutral, most ordinary possible place, Latin. The word niger, pronounced niger in classical Latin, meaning simply black, the colour, nothing more, nothing less, a colour adjective with no more social weight than the word for white or red or green. It passed into Spanish and Portuguese as negro, the standard word for the colour black in those languages to this day. It passed into early modern French as negre, and it passed into English through the Portuguese and Spanish traders who were already using negro to describe the African people they were encountering along the West African coast. The earliest known published use of a form of the word in English dates to 1574 in a work referring to the Nigers of Ethiop, a colour descriptor for a people, neutral, descriptive, with no more inherent violence than calling a red-haired person red-haired. What changed it? Because the word did not become what it became through linguistic drift, through the naturalist, organic, unpredictable evolution of language. It became what it became through slavery, as the transatlantic slave trade expanded, as the plantation system grew, as the ideology of racial hierarchy was built to justify what the economics required. The word that described the people being enslaved was loaded, deliberately, with contempt, with dehumanization, with the specific, intentional, linguistic work of making the people it described feel like less than people. By the early 1800s, it had firmly established itself as a derogatory name, not a colour word, not a neutral descriptor, a weapon used in slave codes, in plantation records, in colonial law, in the mouths of overseers and slave catchers and presidents and neighbours and children who had been taught by their parents that this was the correct word for this category of human being. What the word was designed to do, because the word was not simply an insult. An insult is casual, personal, situational. This word was a tool of a system designed to do specific, identifiable, measurable, psychological work. It told the person it was used on that they were permanently, categorically, irreversibly beneath the person using it. Not in this moment, not in this argument, not because of anything they had done, by nature, by birth, by the colour of their skin, forever. It was used in the presence of, and in the mouths of, white children addressing black adults who were old enough to be their grandparents, to communicate one specific message. You have no authority here, no dignity here, no status here, regardless of your age, regardless of your experience, regardless of your wisdom, regardless of anything you have ever done or been or built. The word was a daily, constant, unavoidable reminder of the system and the person's place in it. Frederick Douglass, and the word, because Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery, who taught himself to read, who became one of the greatest orators and writers and advocates in American history, left us the most precise, most chilling description of how the word was used as a tool of control. In his autobiography, he described the scene when his enslaver discovered that Douglass was learning to read. He imagined his master saying, "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. A nigger should know nothing but to obey." The word embedded in the statement about obedience, the category created by the word used to define the limits of what was permissible for the person it described. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Not the best person, not the best man, the best nigger, a category beneath person, beneath man, a category whose highest aspiration was obedience. The word in law, because the word was not confined to casual conversation. It appeared in slave codes, in court documents, in legal rulings, in the official, authoritative, legally binding language of the American state. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court issued one of the most infamous rulings in its history. The Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not and could not be citizens of the United States and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. Written by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1857, the word and the ideology behind it were not just in the mouths of the ignorant and the cruel. They were in the highest court in the land. The word, after emancipation, because the end of slavery in 1865 did not end the word. If anything, the word became more violent after emancipation, because before emancipation, the system of slavery enforced the hierarchy, the chains, the codes, the legal architecture did the work of keeping people in their assigned place. After emancipation, with the legal architecture dismantled, the word became one of the primary tools of maintaining by terror what the law could no longer maintain by force. It was used in the presence of lynchings. It was used by the Ku Klux Klan on their crosses and in their robes and in their letters to black families, threatening violence. It was used in the mouths of police officers, in the pens of judges, in the reports of newspaper editors who described black victims of violence with the word as if it explained what had been done to them. The word, after emancipation, was a threat, a reminder, a signal that the freedom was conditional. The reclamation, because here is where the chapter turns from the long dark history of what the word was used to do to the extraordinary, complex, contested, remarkable act of reclamation. Sometime in the history of African American communities, the word began to be used within the community differently, not as a weapon, as something else, as a greeting, as a term of solidarity, as a marker of shared experience, shared suffering, shared survival. The same word that had been used to dehumanize, repurposed within the community it targeted as a term of connection, not a comfortable repurposing, not a simple one, not one without genuine, serious, ongoing debate within the black community itself about whether and how and in what context the repurposing is valid, but a real one, documented, present, ongoing, and, in the words of the scholars who have studied it, one of the most extraordinary acts of linguistic resistance in the history of the English language, what the reclamation means linguistically. Because there is a linguistic principle at work in the reclamation that is worth understanding. When a group reclaims a word that was used against them, they are not simply adopting the word. They are changing what it means to use it, and who has the authority to use it, and what it signals when it is used. The word in the mouth of someone who uses it as a slur against a black person carries 500 years of that history. The dehumanization, the architecture of slavery, the Dred Scott decision, the lynchings, all of it carried in that word when used as it was designed to be used. The same word used between people within the community it was used to destroy carries something entirely different, a recognition of shared history, a signal of trust, a marker of the community that survived. What the word was used to facilitate. Same word, different context, different speaker, different meaning, different weight entirely. The debate within the community, because the reclamation is not universally accepted within the black community. There are black scholars, black artists, black community leaders, black families who believe that the word should not be used by anyone at all, ever, regardless of context, regardless of speaker, regardless of intention, who argue that the word carries too much history, too much pain, too much violence to be repurposed, that to use it, even in reclamation, is to keep it alive when it should be allowed to die. And there are black artists and comedians and musicians and ordinary people who use it freely within the community as a marker of exactly the solidarity and shared experience we described. Both positions are held by serious people. Both positions are rooted in the same history. Both positions are, in their own way, responses to the same 500 years of the same word used as a weapon. The debate is not for people outside the community to resolve. Why non-black people cannot use it? Because this is the question that the history answers most clearly. Why, when the word is used between members of the black community, it can carry solidarity and connection, but when used by a non-black person, it carries only the 500 years of its weaponization. The answer is in who built the weapon. The word was built by the people who enslaved, used by the people who lynched, written into the law by the people who legislated against black humanity. When a non-black person uses the word, they are, whether they intend it or not, picking up that weapon. They are standing in a lineage of use that goes all the way back to the plantation and the slave code and the Dred Scott decision. There is no version of that history that makes it acceptable Not familiarity, not friendship, not the fact that they heard it in a song. The history does not change based on the intention of the person using the word. What the word tells us about language and power, because the full history of this word, from the neutral Latin to the nuclear bomb of racial epithets to the complex act of reclamation, tells us something about language itself that is worth carrying beyond this chapter. Language is not neutral. Words are not just sounds or letters or symbols on a page. Words carry the history of everyone who has ever used them, the contexts in which they were spoken, the power relationships in which they functioned, the specific, documented, measurable human suffering they were used to enable. A word can begin as a colour adjective in Latin and end as the nuclear bomb of racial epithets in English, not because of anything inherent in the sounds that make it up, because of what was done with those sounds over 500 years of history that we have been examining tonight. Let the word settle into the history it carries from the Latin that meant nothing but a colour, through the slave codes and the plantation records and the Supreme Court decisions and the lynchings, to the reclamation that is still being debated within the community it was used to destroy. 500 years, one word. The nuclear bomb of racial epithets. And the most extraordinary act of linguistic resistance in the history of the English language. The resistance, what they did anyway, not the resistance of words, but of action. Nat Turner, who led one of the most significant slave rebellions in American history. Harriet Tubman, who went back 13 times. The Underground Railroad, that was not a railroad and not underground, but was one of the most extraordinary, organised, sustained, dangerous acts of collective resistance in American history, and the songs that carried the roots in their melodies, because nobody could arrest a song, but only when you need it. The word is behind us. The resistance is ahead, and it was extraordinary. Everything was designed to make resistance impossible. The chains, the slave codes, the anti-literacy laws, the destruction of language, the separation of families, the legal permission to beat people to death without consequence. The system was comprehensive. It had been built by people who understood that if you want to hold millions of people in bondage against their will, you must make the cost of resistance as high as possible. And the people resisted anyway, not occasionally, not in isolated moments of individual courage, constantly, systematically, in ways, large and small, documented and undocumented, extraordinary and ordinary, was across the entire 250 years of American slavery. Tonight, we look at the resistance, the everyday resistance, first, because before we get to the rebellions and the Underground Railroad and the names that history recorded, I want to start with the resistance that history mostly did not record. The small acts, the daily, quiet, persistent acts of resistance that required as much courage as anything that happened on a larger scale, working slowly, deliberately slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, pretending to misunderstand instructions, poisoning, when they could, the food of the people who owned them, growing a small garden in secret when the slave codes just said they could not own property, teaching each other to read at night when the law said it was forbidden, maintaining cultural practices in the spaces the system could not fully reach, preserving in the music, in the stories, in the rhythms, in the names that only the family knew, a connection to who they had been before the plantation that the system could not legislate away. Running because one of the most significant, most documented forms of everyday resistance was simply leaving, running away, northward, alone or in small groups, at night, following the North Star or the moss growing on the north side of tree trunks, or the songs that carried the directions in their melodies. The numbers of people who attempted to run is impossible to calculate. The numbers who succeeded is disputed, but what is not disputed is that the system devoted extraordinary resources to preventing it. Slave patrols, organised, armed, legally empowered, groups of white men whose specific purpose was to patrol the roads and paths and forests and catch anyone who was moving without permission. Bounty hunters wanted posters describing runaway enslaved people the way wanted posters describe criminals, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it illegal for anyone, even in the free northern states, to assist an escaped person, which meant that even freedom was not safe. Nat Turner and the rebellion, because the resistance was not only quiet. On the evening of August 21st, 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia, an enslaved man named Nat Turner began what would become the deadliest slave revolt in the history of the United States. Turner was a preacher, a deeply religious man who had taught himself to read and who believed with complete conviction that he had been called by God to lead his people out of bondage. He had seen signs, a solar eclipse in February 1831, that he believed was a message from God that the time had come. On the night of August 21st, Turner and a small group of followers began at his enslaver's house and moved through Southampton County, killing as they went. Over the course of a day in Southampton County, Turner and his allies killed 55 white men, women, and children as the rebels made their way toward Jerusalem. Less than 24 hours after the revolt began, the rebels encountered organised resistance and were defeated. Turner himself evaded capture for 6 weeks, hiding in the woods, moving only at night, until he was finally found on October 30th. He was tried, convicted, and hanged on November 11th. What happened after Turner? Because the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion tells you everything about what the system was afraid of. Nat Turner destroyed the white Southern myth that slaves were actually happy with their lives or too docile to undertake is a violent rebellion. His revolt hardened pro-slavery attitudes among Southern whites and led to new oppressive legislation prohibiting the education. Movement an assembly of slaves, the response was immediate and brutal. White militias and mobs killed as many as 200 black people, most of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion. Turner's body, after his hanging, was reportedly beheaded, quartered, and skinned. His skin used to make souvenir purses. Not to punish Turner, he was already dead. To send a message to everyone who might consider following him, and yet the message that echoed most loudly through the South was not the one the slaveholders intended to send. It was Turner's that it was possible, that the myth of the contented slave was exactly that, a myth, and that the people being held in bondage had not accepted their bondage. Toussaint Louverture and Haiti, because Nat Turner was not the only extraordinary act of collective resistance in the history of slavery. 30 years before Turner, in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, in what is now Haiti, an enslaved man named Toussaint Louverture led the only successful slave revolution in human history. Haiti, in 1791, was the most profitable colony in the entire Caribbean, producing 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half of its coffee, on the backs of 500,000 enslaved people who outnumbered the white population 10 to 1. Toussaint Louverture, who had taught himself to read, who had studied military tactics, who had, by some accounts, been given his freedom before the revolution, organized the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue into a fighting force that defeated, in turn, the armies of France, Spain, and Britain. In 1804, Haiti became the first black republic in the history of the world, the first nation ever founded by formerly enslaved people, and the slaveholding nations of the world were terrified. Harriet Tubman and Moses, because the resistance was not only armed rebellion, it was also Harriet Tubman, born around 1820 in Dorchester County, Maryland, enslaved from birth, beaten repeatedly, including a blow to her head from a 2-pound metal weight thrown by an overseer at another enslaved person. That struck Tubman instead, fracturing her skull, giving her seizures and blackouts for the rest of her life. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped alone on foot, following the North Star to Philadelphia, and then she went back, not once, not twice, approximately 13 times over the next decade. She returned to the South to guide others to freedom. Each return was a death sentence if she was caught. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that bounty hunters were actively searching for her. She had a price on her head of $40,000, an extraordinary sum in the 1850s. She was never caught. What she said, because Harriet Tubman left us her own words. She said, "I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. But I was free, and they should be free. Not, I was free, and I was safe. Not, I was free, and I was done. I was free, and they should be free. So I went back 13 times into the place that had broken my skull and stolen my family and tried to make me into property, and she never lost a passenger, as she said herself in 1896, speaking at a women's suffrage convention. I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. The Underground Railroad, what it actually was, because the Underground Railroad was not a railroad, and it was not underground. It was a network of people, black and white, enslaved and free, religious abolitionists, freed black people, Quakers who had opposed slavery on religious grounds for a century, ordinary people with spare rooms and barns and cellars and the willingness to risk everything to hide someone who was running. It had a language. Stations were the safe houses, conductors were the guides, passengers were the people being guided. The promised land was Canada, where the Fugitive Slave Act could not reach, and it had a code hidden in the music, songs that sounded like spirituals, like worship, like the ordinary music of an enslaved community that contained within their lyrics and their rhythms specific, practical, life-saving information. Follow the drinking gourd being the Big Dipper, pointing to the North Star, the direction of freedom. Let the resistance settle into the history it earned. Nat Turner hiding in the woods for 6 weeks after the rebellion, with the entire state militia looking for him. Harriet Tubman going back 13 times into the place that had broken her skull. Frederick Douglass writing the words that made it impossible to look away, and the music in the dark carrying everything that could not be legislated away. Emancipation and the betrayal. 1865, the end of slavery. What freedom actually looked like. The £20 million paid to the enslavers, not the enslaved. Reconstruction and the extraordinary 10-year window of possibility that opened, and how it was systematically, deliberately, comprehensively closed, but only when you need it. The resistance is behind us. The emancipation is ahead, and the betrayal is already being planned. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be, free. Those words have rung through American history ever since, taught in schools, celebrated as a turning point, quoted as the moment when America began to live up to the promise of its founding. And those words are genuinely important. The Emancipation Proclamation was a real, significant, consequential document. But the full story of what it actually did and what it did not do is considerably more complicated. What the Emancipation Proclamation actually did, because the document that is celebrated as freeing 4 million enslaved people immediately freed approximately 50,000 of them, not 4 million, 50,000, because the Emancipation Proclamation applied only to the states that had seceded from the United States and were still in active rebellion. It expressly exempted parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Northern control, and it left slavery entirely untouched in the loyal border states that had not seceded. It was a war measure, not a moral declaration, not a sweeping, comprehensive, immediate abolition of slavery, a military document designed to weaken the Confederacy by encouraging enslaved people to flee toward Union lines, as Frederick Douglass, who welcomed it as a first chapter in a new national history, also understood its freedom depended entirely on Union military victory. The document could declare people free. Only the army could make them free. The 13th Amendment and the 4 words, because the actual legal abolition of slavery came with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified on December 6th. It reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Neither slavery sought nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime." 4 words, except as a punishment for crime. Those 4 words created a legal loophole in the very document that abolished slavery, a loophole that would be used almost immediately to recreate through the criminal justice system something that looked remarkably like the thing that had just been abolished. We will return to those 4 words in Chapter 10, but plant them here because they matter enormously. Juneteenth, and the last to know, because even the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued on January 1st, 1863, did not reach everyone at the same time. In Galveston, Texas, the westernmost Confederate-controlled city, the news did not arrive until June 19th. 2.5 years after the proclamation, 2 months after the end of the Civil War, on that day, Union troops arrived and announced to the people of Galveston that they were free, that they had been legally free for 2.5 years, and that nobody had told them. June 19th, Juneteenth, now a federal holiday in the United States, celebrating not just the end of slavery, but the moment when the last people to know about it finally found out. The compensation paid to the wrong people, because here is the detail that I find the most revealing, single fact about emancipation, not in America, in Britain, where slavery was abolished 30 years earlier in 1833. When the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, it made provision for compensation for the financial loss that abolition would cause. The compensation was £20 million, 40% of the Treasury's annual income, one of the largest financial transactions in British history. It was not paid to the people who had been enslaved. It was paid to the people who had enslaved them. More than 40,000 awards to slave owners across the British colonies to compensate them for the loss of their property. The enslaved people received nothing. Not nothing in comparison, not a smaller share, nothing. Not a penny, not an acre, not a tool, not a house, nothing. And the debt that Britain took on to pay those slave owners was so large, so extraordinarily large, that British taxpayers were still paying it off in 2015. 40 acres and a mule, and the promise that wasn't. Because in America, in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, there was a moment of extraordinary possibility. General William Sherman, in January 1865, issued Special Field Order No. 15, setting aside 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts for redistribution to newly freed families. 40 acres per family. The use of army mules to work the land. 40 acres and a mule. The promise of land, of economic foundation, of the material means to build a life on what had been taken. Approximately 40,000 black families began to settle the land, and then President Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, who succeeded him, and who was openly, aggressively, unapologetically hostile to black political and economic advancement, reversed the order. The land was returned to the Confederate owners who had lost it by fighting a war to preserve slavery. The families who had begun to settle the land were evicted. Reconstruction, the window that opened, because, despite the broken promise of the land, the period immediately after emancipation was genuinely extraordinary. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, 12 years in which the federal government maintained troops in the South to protect the civil and political rights of newly freed people, and what black Americans built in those 12 years was remarkable. Schools established, sometimes in single rooms, sometimes outdoors, by communities who had been forbidden to learn to read just years before, and who now built what would become historically black colleges and universities that still exist today. Churches established as the centres of black community life, political organisation, cultural preservation, and spiritual sustenance. Political participation, extraordinary and real. Black men voting for the first time. Black men being elected to state legislatures, to Congress. 2 black men elected to the United States Senate during Reconstruction. The window was open, and black Americus walked through it with extraordinary, purposeful, determined speed. The Klan and the terror, because the window opening produced an immediate, violent, organised response. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, by 6 former Confederate officers, not as a political organisation, not as a cultural movement, as a terrorist organisation, specifically designed to use violence and the threat of violence to prevent black political participation and to restore white supremacy in the South. They burned churches, they attacked schools, they murdered black voters, black politicians, black community leaders, and white people who supported black rights. Between 1865 and 1877, the Klan and affiliated groups killed an estimated thousands of black people across the South, and the federal government, for a time, fought back. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 gave the president the authority to use federal troops against the Klan, and for a time it worked. The Klan was suppressed, its leaders prosecuted. For a time, the Compromise of 1877 and the betrayal, because the window that had opened in 1865 was closed in 1877. Not gradually, not by the passage of time, by a deal. The presidential election of 1876 was disputed, the outcome contested, between Republican Rutherford Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. And in the negotiations that followed, the Republican allies of Hayes made a deal with Southern Democrats. Hayes would be awarded the presidency in exchange for one thing: the withdrawal of all federal troops from the South, the troops whose presence was the only thing standing between the newly freed people of the South and the organized terror of those who wanted to return them to something as close to slavery as the law would allow. The deal was made. The troops were withdrawn, and the Compromise of 1877 was later called by historians the Great Betrayal. What happened when the troops left? Because the consequences of the troop withdrawal were immediate, comprehensive, and devastating. The Redeemer Democrats, who had been waiting, took control of southern state governments, one by one, state by state. Black Republicans felt betrayed as they lost power, being exposed to domestic terrorism and voter suppression. By 1905, virtually all black men were effectively disenfranchised by state legislatures in every southern state. Let that sit for a moment. By 1905, 40 years after emancipation, virtually all black men in every southern state effectively unable to vote. The 2 black senators who had served during Reconstruction would be the last black senators from the South for almost a century. The schools that had been built were undermined, defunded, segregated into systems deliberately designed to provide inferior education to black children, and the terror that the Klan had been temporarily suppressed from resumed. What freedom actually looked like. Because I want to be specific about what the people who had been enslaved actually faced on the day they were free. No land, no money, no tools, no education, in most cases, no legal standing to enforce any contracts they might enter in a society that did not want them to succeed in a region that was actively, violently trying to return them to bondage in everything but name. And the system that emerged to manage this situation was called sharecropping. Formerly enslaved people working the same land they had worked before for a share of the crop that was calculated by the landowner against debts for tools and seed and housing, also calculated by the landowner, in a system where the person doing the work could never quite get ahead. Freedom that looked from a certain angle remarkably like what had come before it, what was built anyway. Because, as always in this story, the response to what was done was extraordinary. In the years immediately after emancipation, despite the broken promises, despite the terror, despite the sharecropping, despite the great betrayal, black communities built. They built churches, they built schools, they built banks, they built newspapers, they built mutual aid societies just that supported community members in crisis. They built entire towns. Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, a community so economically successful, so culturally vibrant, so self-sufficient that it became a model of what Black America could build when it was left to build. And in 1921, a white mob, supported by local officials and by aircraft, from which bombs were dropped, burned it to the ground. 35 blocks destroyed in 16 hours. Over 300 people killed because the success was intolerable. Let the emancipation settle into the full complexity of what it was. The declaration that changed everything and immediately freed 50,000. The amendment that abolished slavery with a 4-word loophole, the £20 million to the enslavers paid off by British taxpayers in 2015, the 40 acres promised and taken back, the 12 years of Reconstruction when something extraordinary was being built, and the great betrayal of 1877 when the troops left and the window was closed. Jim Crow, the second slavery, the legal architecture of segregation built to replace the legal architecture of slavery. Separate but equal. The Supreme Court decision, that was neither. The lynching, that was not just violence, but spectacle, and the extraordinary, documented, horrifying detail of what Jim Crow actually was for the people who lived under it, but only when you need it. Emancipation is behind us. Jim Crow is ahead. And the second slavery is already being built. Slavery was abolished in 1865, and within a single decade, a new system had been built to replace it, not informally, not through social custom alone, not through the quiet persistence of prejudice that one might charitably describe as human nature, legally, deliberately, with the same careful, systematic, architectural precision that had built the first system, Jim Crow, the second slavery, named after a minstrel character, a white performer in blackface, dancing, a caricature of black life for the entertainment of white audiences, the name itself a mockery attached to a system of oppression, homoplessy and the train, because the legal foundation of Jim Crow was laid by a single Supreme Court decision in 1896, and the story of how that decision came to be begins with a man on a train, homoplessy, a shoemaker from New Orleans, a man who was, by Louisiana law, classified as black despite being, by his own appearance and by the composition of his ancestry, 7/8 white. In 1892, Plessy, backed by a citizens' committee fighting segregation, boarded a train in New Orleans and sat down in the car reserved for white passengers. The conductor asked him if he was a coloured man. He said, "I am an American citizen. I have paid for a first-class ticket, and I intend to ride to Covington in the first-class car." The conductor stopped the train. A detective boarded, and Plessy was arrested and dragged off the train. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, because in 1896 the United States Supreme Court ruled 7-1 against Plessy against equality, against the plain meaning of the 14th Amendment that had been written specifically to guarantee equal protection under the law to all Americans. The majority opinion, written by Justice Henry Billings Brown, established the doctrine of separate but equal. Separate facilities for white and black Americans were constitutional, the court said, as long as they were equal. Separate but equal, 3 words that became the legal foundation for racial segregation in the United States for the next 58 years. There was one dissent, Justice John Marshall Harlan, the only justice who voted against the majority, wrote, "Our Constitution is colourblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." He was ignored for 58 years. What Jim Crow actually said, because separate but equal was the legal doctrine, and Jim Crow was the architecture built on top of it after the 1896 decision. State legislatures enacted segregation statutes that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, orphanages, prisons, virtually all forms of public transportation, sports, recreation, water fountains, restrooms, waiting rooms, telephone booths, libraries, cemeteries, even textbooks. White children and black children could not legally use the same textbooks in certain states. The separation was total, comprehensive, designed to make the message impossible to miss. You are in a separate category from those above you in everything, in every space, every day, everywhere you go. Ida B. Wells and the investigation, because the lynching had someone who documented it, who investigated it, who refused to let it go unnamed for what it was. Ida B. Wells, born in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862, the daughter of enslaved people, a journalist, an editor, one of the most courageous, most consequential, most important investigative journalists in American history. After 3 of her friends were lynched in Memphis, Tennessee in 1892, Wells launched a systematic, documented, exhaustively researched investigation into the practice of lynching. What she found was what we stated a moment ago. The justifications were false. The crime of rape, cited so often as the reason, was invoked in a minority of cases. And in many of those cases, what had actually happened was a consensual relationship between a black man and a white woman that the white community refused to recognize as consensual. She published her findings in a pamphlet called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases in 1892, and the response in Memphis was to destroy the printing press of the newspaper she edited and to warn her that if she ever returned to Memphis, she would be killed. She documented the lynching anyway, from exile, for the rest of her life. The disenfranchisement and the tricks, because Jim Crow was not only segregation and terror, it was also the systematic, comprehensive, legally sophisticated removal of black political power. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, had guaranteed black men the right to vote. The South could not legally take that right away directly, so they found other ways. The poll tax, a fee required to vote in a region where black workers were paid almost nothing. The fee was deliberately set at a level that black families could rarely afford. The literacy test required to register to vote, administered by white registrars who could and did ask black applicants questions that no one could answer. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? How many jelly beans in a jar? Questions with no correct answer. Because the point was not to test literacy. The point was to fail the applicant. The grandfather clause, which stated that a person could vote without paying the poll tax or passing the literacy test if their grandfather had been eligible to vote, which, for anyone whose grandfather had been enslaved, was, by definition, impossible. The sundown towns, because Jim Crow was not only a southern phenomenon. Across America, not just the South, thousands of towns became what historians call sundown towns. Towns where black people were not permitted to be after dark. Some had signs posted at the town limits, read, "Nen, don't let the sun set on you in this town." Some had an informal understanding enforced by the police or by violence, or both. Historian James Lowen, who spent years documenting sundown towns, estimated that as many as 10,000 sundown towns existed in the United States at the peak of the practice. Not all in the South, in the Midwest, in New England, in the West. Jim Crow was a national phenomenon that the nation has largely blamed on the South alone. Emmett Till and what it cost, because Jim Crow killed people. Not only the documented lynchings, not only the organised terror, it killed people in the ordinary, daily encounter between a black person and the system designed to destroy them. Emmett Till, 14 years old, from Chicago, visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi, in August 1955. He was accused of whistling at or touching the hand of a white woman named Carolyn Bryant in a store. The precise nature of what happened is disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. 3 days later, Bryant's husband Roy and his half-brother J.W. Millam drove to the home of Emmett Till's great-uncle in the middle of the night. They dragged Emmett Till out of the house. They beat him. They gouged out one eye. They shot him in the head. They weighted his body with a 75-pound cotton gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire, and they threw him into the Tallahatchie River. He was 14 years old. The trial and what his mother did. Because the story of Emmett Till does not end with the river. Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam were arrested, tried, by an all-white jury in Mississippi in 1955. The jury deliberated for 67 minutes and acquitted both men. One juror later said, "It wouldn't have taken that long if we hadn't stopped to drink a soda pop." Bryant and Milam, protected from Double Jeopardy by the acquittal, gave an interview to Look magazine in 1956, confessing to the murder in detail, knowing they could never be tried again. But Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, did something that changed the course of American history. She insisted on an open casket. She said, "I want the world to see what they did to my son." The photographs of Emmett Till's body in the open casket, published in Jet magazine, were seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and the civil rights movement, which was already stirring, caught fire. What Jim Crow produced in those who survived it, because Jim Crow, like slavery before it, did not produce what it intended. It intended to produce a broken people, defeated, compliant, convinced of their own inferiority. What it produced was the civil rights movement. Every generation that lived under Jim Crow produced people who refused it, people who organized against it, people who sat down in the seats they were not supposed to sit in, people who walked instead of riding segregated buses, people who registered to vote knowing that the registration process was designed to humiliate and fail them, and who came back the next day anyway. Jim Crow was designed to produce resignation. It produced Rosa Parks. Let Jim Crow settle into the full weight of what it was. The Supreme Court, 7-1, separate but equal. The list that never seemed to end of everything that was segregated. The lynching, advertised in advance, photographed, turned into postcards. Ida B. Wells documenting it from exile. The poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause. Emmett Till, 14 years old, in the Tallahatchie River, and his mother, who insisted on the open casket and changed American history with that insistence. Chapter 9 is waiting. The Great Migration and what they built. 6 million people leaving the South between 1910 and 1970. Not refugees, people with purpose, with plans, with extraordinary, creative, economic, cultural ambition. And what they built when they arrived changed the world, but only when you need it. Jim Crow is behind us. The Great Migration is ahead, and 6 million people are already moving. Between 1910 and 1970, 6 million black Americans left the South. 6 million, not refugees in the way. That word implies people without agency, without choice, without direction. People with purpose, with destinations, with family members who had gone ahead and written back to say, "Come, there are jobs here, there are schools here. Nobody is advertising. You're lynching in the newspaper. Come." They came. Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, who spent 15 years documenting the Great Migration, described it as the first time in American history that the lowest caste people signaled they had options and were willing to take them. These people, by their actions, were able to do what the powers that be, North and South, could not or would not do. They freed themselves. Why they left and what they left behind, because the reasons for the Great Migration were not mysterious They were Jim Crow, sharecropping, the poll tax, the literacy test, the lynching, advertised in advance and photographed and turned into postcards. In 1910, 90% of black Americans lived in the South. More than 90% of them in rural areas, farming land they didn't own for a share they could never quite accumulate into anything. And then the First World War began, and the factories of the North, which had been staffed by European immigrant labour, found that the European immigrants were no longer coming. Because Europe was at war, the factories needed workers, the recruiters went south, and the letters went back, and the trains filled up where they went, and the numbers, because the Great Migration transformed the demographic, geographic, cultural, and political map of America. In the decade between 1910 and 1920, the black population of major northern cities grew by extraordinary numbers. New York grew by 66%, Chicago grew by 148%, Philadelphia grew by 500%, Detroit grew by 611%. 611% in a decade. And these were not people arriving and disappearing into the existing fabric of northern cities. They were people arriving and building their own communities, their own neighbourhoods, their own churches, their own newspapers, their own institutions, their own culture, because the North, while technically without the legal architecture of Jim Crow, was not a land of equality. Housing discrimination, employment discrimination, the unwritten rules of a different kind of segregation awaited them, and they built anyway, Harlem and the Renaissance. Because of all the things the Great Migration produced, the most extraordinary, most consequential, most historically significant was what happened in a neighbourhood in Upper Manhattan, Harlem, once an upper class, all-white neighbourhood of brownstone townhouses and tree-lined streets in New York City, transformed by the Great Migration into the most densely, most vibrantly, most creatively, most intellectually alive black community the world had ever seen. By 1920, Harlem housed more than 200,000 African Americans, and what they produced in those streets, in those clubs, in those apartments, in those churches, in those newspapers, in those conversations between people who had come from everywhere in the South, bringing everything they had preserved through slavery and Jim Crow, and the Middle Passage before that was the Harlem Renaissance. What the Harlem Renaissance was, because the Harlem Renaissance was not just an artistic movement. It was an assertion, a declaration, a comprehensive, extraordinary, multifaceted, defiant insistence on the full humanity and full creative capacity of black people in the face of everything the system had spent centuries trying to deny. The writers gave us Langston Hughes, known as the Poet Laureate of Harlem, who wrote about racial injustice and racial consciousness and the beauty of black everyday life in language that nobody had used in American literature before. Who wrote, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, and then run? What happens to a dream deferred?" The question of an entire people compressed into 7 lines of poetry, and Zora Neale Hurston, the queen of the Harlem Renaissance, anthropologist, folklorist, novelist, the first black graduate of Barnard College in 1928, who wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937 in 7 weeks while conducting anthropological fieldwork in Haiti, a novel that celebrated black culture, black dialect, black womanhood with a completeness and a love and a lack of apology that was unlike almost anything that had appeared in American literature before it. Who wrote, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can anyone deny themselves as the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me." Zora Neale Hurston, who died in 1960 in a welfare home in Florida and was buried in an unmarked grave because the America she had enriched so profoundly could not bring itself to sustain her, until Alice Walker, the author of The Colour Purple, found the grave in 1973 and put a marker on it and told the world what it had lost. Webb Du Bois and the double consciousness. Because the Harlem Renaissance was not only novelists and poets, it was also Webb Du Bois, sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, one of the most important, most intellectually consequential, most visionary thinkers in American history, who articulated in his 1903 masterwork, The Souls of Black Folk, the concept of double consciousness. He wrote, "It is a peculiar sensation. This double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, 2 souls, 2 warring ideals in one dark body." The most precise, most honest, most permanently true description of the Black American experience, written in 1903, and still, 120 years later, still not superseded. The music, that changed everything, because the Harlem Renaissance was not only words, it was the music, the musicians who had carried the rhythms of West Africa through the hold of the slave ship, through the plantation, through Jim Crow, arrived in Harlem and in Chicago and in Kansas City, and played Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Jelly Roll Morton, Cab Calloway, playing jazz in the clubs that white New Yorkers began coming uptown to hear, crossing the invisible lines of a segregated city to sit in clubs where the music demanded their presence, the music doing what the laws would not do, pulling people across the divide by the force of what it was, and the blues, brought north from the Mississippi Delta by the people who had created it in the fields, in the churches, in the spaces between the work and the rest that the plantation allowed, transformed in the northern cities into something that would eventually become rock and roll, the Green Book, and how they travelled, because the Great Migration was not just a northward movement. Black Americans were moving across America visiting family, travelling for work, trying to use the country they had built and fought for and died for, and travelling as a black American in the Jim Crow era was extraordinarily dangerous. Which gas station would serve you? Which hotel would give you a room? Which restaurant would feed you? Which town was a sundown town that you could not be in after dark without risking your life? Victor Hugo Green, a postal worker from Harlem, began publishing a guide in 1936, the Negro Motorist Green Book, a practical guide to which businesses in which towns across America would serve black travellers, which hotels, which restaurants, which gas stations, which barbershops, which beauty salons. It was used by millions for 30 years, until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it, technically, no longer necessary. A travel guide to navigate your own country safely. What the Great Migration changed politically. Because the Great Migration did not only produce culture, it produced political power. In the South, under Jim Crow, black Americans were effectively disenfranchised. The poll taxes, the literacy tests, the grandfather clauses, the terror had seen to that. In the North, black Americans could vote, and they did, in numbers. That changed the calculations of American politics. In Chicago, in New York, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, black voters became a constituency that politicians could not afford to ignore. Black newspapers, like the Chicago Defender, circulated throughout the South, smuggled onto trains, passed from hand to hand, reporting on the conditions of black life in the North, advocating for migration, for political engagement, for the full exercise of every right that the Constitution promised. The political power built during the Great Migration would eventually become a foundation of the civil rights movement. What Isabel Wilkerson understood, because Isabel Wilkerson, who spent 15 years interviewing the people who made the Great Migration and their children and their grandchildren, understood something about it that most history books miss. She described it as the first time in American history that the most oppressed people in the country voted with their feet. They did not petition the government. They did not wait for the legal architecture of Jim Crow to be dismantled before they moved. They moved, and the movement itself was the statement, we will not stay and accept this. We will leave, and what you lose when we go is your problem. The South lost 6 million people, 6 million of its workers, 6 million of its farmers, 6 million of the people whose labour had built everything it had, and the South panicked. Employers tried to stop the trains, threatened workers who helped people leave, arrested people at train stations. The trains left anyway. What they built in total, because I want to step back before this chapter closes and look at the full picture of what the Great Migration produced. It produced the Harlem Renaissance, the greatest single flowering of black artistic, intellectual, and cultural production in American history. It produced jazz and the blues and gospel and soul and eventually hip-hop by placing the people who carried those musical traditions in cities where they could reach the world. It produced political power that would eventually elect black mayors, black governors, black senators, and, in 2008, a black president of the United States. It produced Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Webb Du Bois, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and eventually Barack Obama. All of them products, direct or indirect, of the decision of 6 million people to board a train, let the Great Migration settle into the extraordinary scale of what it was. 6 million people voting with their feet, Detroit growing 611% in a decade, Harlem housing 200,000, producing the Renaissance, Langston Hughes asking, what happens to a dream deferred? Zora Neale Hurston buried in an unmarked grave until Alice Walker put a marker on it, and the trains leaving anyway when the South tried to stop them, from the plantation to the prison. The 13th Amendment loophole, those 4 words, except as a punishment for crime, convict leasing, chain gangs, mass incarceration, the extraordinary, documented, undeniable thread that runs from the plantation to the prison, unbroken to today, but only when you need it. The Great Migration is behind us. The prison is ahead, and the thread is already running. We planted 4 words in Chapter 7. We said, remember them because they matter enormously. Tonight, we return to them. The 13th Amendment, ratified December 6th, 1865, reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction, except as a punishment for crime. 4 words written into the very document. That abolished slavery, a loophole in the abolition of a loophole, an exception carved into the most important constitutional amendment since the Bill of Rights. And those 4 words were used almost immediately to recreate through the criminal justice system something that looked, functioned, and was experienced remarkably like the thing that had just been abolished. The black codes immediately, because the southern states did not wait. Within months of the 13th Amendment being ratified, southern state legislatures passed what became known as the Black Codes, new laws explicitly, in many cases, applying only to black people, criminalizing behaviors that had never been crimes before: loitering, vagrancy, breaking curfew, not carrying proof of employment, having weapons, assembling in groups without white supervision. These were not serious crimes. They were the ordinary activities of ordinary people going about their daily lives. But for a black person in the post-emancipation South, they were criminal offences punishable by fines that newly freed people with no money could not pay. And when you could not pay the fine, you went to prison, and in prison, under the 13th Amendment, you could be put to work without pay, under compulsion, exactly as before. Convict leasing, slavery by another name, because the prison under the Black Codes was not designed to rehabilitate or to punish in the conventional sense, or to protect society from dangerous criminals. It was designed to produce labour. The system was called convict leasing. State governments leased their prison populations to private businesses, plantations, mines, railroads, logging operations, brickworks. The businesses paid the state for the labour. The state kept the money. The prisoners received nothing. And the conditions, in some cases, were worse than slavery. Not better. Worse. Because under slavery, an enslaved person had a monetary value to their enslaver. Killing them was destroying your own property. There was an economic incentive not to work them to death. Under convict leasing, the business had paid a fixed fee to the state for a prisoner. If the prisoner died, the state simply provided another one. The incentive to keep them alive was gone. Angola, and what it tells us. Because the most extraordinary, most direct, most impossible to dismiss piece of evidence for the thread running from the plantation to the prison is a single, specific, real, existing place. Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, located in West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, the largest maximum security prison in the United States, covering 18,000 acres, named for the country in West Africa where most of its enslaved people originally came from. Angola was, before emancipation, a plantation where enslaved people from Angola in West Africa worked the fields. After emancipation, it became a convict leasing operation where black men convicted of minor offences under the Black Codes worked the same fields. In 1901, the state of Louisiana purchased the plantation and converted it into a state prison, where prisoners, predominantly black, work the fields, the same land, the same crops, a different name for the people doing the work, but the same land, the same fields, the same work, the same in almost every way that matters. Jarvius Cotton and 5 generations. Because the legal scholar, Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness in 2010, opens her book with a story that says everything about the thread. She writes about a man named Jarvius Cotton. Jarvius Cotton's great-great-grandfather could not vote as a slave. His great-grandfather was beaten to death by the Ku Klux Klan for attempting to vote. His grandfather thus was prevented from voting by Klan intimidation. His father was barred by poll taxes and literacy tests, and Jarvius Cotton himself cannot vote because, like many black men in the United States, he has been labelled a felon and is currently on parole. 5 generations, the same result. 5 different mechanisms: slavery, violence, intimidation, disenfranchisement laws, criminal conviction. The mechanism changes. The result does not. The numbers today, because the thread from the plantation to the prison is not ancient history. It is tonight's statistics. Despite making up only 12% of the United States population, Black Americans make up approximately 50% of the country's prison population, 12% of the population, 50% of the prisoners. The incarceration rate for Black Americans is more than 5 times the rate for white Americans. And the drug use data that underlies so many of these incarcerations shows that Black Americans use drugs at approximately or the same rate as white Americans. Same usage, 5 times the incarceration rate, the same pattern as the racial disparity in cannabis arrests that we examined in our earlier video, the same pattern as Ehrlichman's confession about the war on drugs, the same pattern as every racial disparity in the American criminal justice system that the data has documented for decades. The war on drugs and the targeting, because the modern mass incarceration of Black Americans did not simply happen, it was built. We established in our earlier video on the history of cannabis that John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, admitted in 1994 that the war on drugs was designed to target 2 communities, the anti-war left and black people, and the data confirms that it worked exactly as intended. Between 1980 and 2008, the number of people incarcerated in America grew from 500,000 to 2.3 million, the largest prison population in the world in absolute numbers and per capita, larger than China, larger than Russia, the land of the free, imprisoning more of its citizens than any authoritarian state on earth, and the communities most targeted, most devastated, most comprehensively destroyed by this expansion were black communities. What a felony conviction means today, because Michelle Alexander, whose book, The New Jim Crow, transformed the way America understands mass incarceration, argues that the criminal label, once applied, follows a person far beyond the prison walls. A felony conviction in America today means, in many states, you cannot vote, you cannot serve on a jury, you cannot access federal student loans, you can be legally denied public housing, you can be legally denied food stamps, you can be legally discriminated against in employment. The rights and opportunities stripped from a person with a felony conviction are, in many cases, permanent, not for the duration of the sentence, for life. Alexander describes it as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control that functions in a manner strikingly similar to Jim Crow. The mechanism has changed, the result has not. The private prison and the profit, because there is one more dimension of the modern mass incarceration system that must be named: the private prison. Companies, publicly traded on the stock market, that operate prisons for profit, that are paid by governments per prisoner per day, which means that their profits grow when the prison population grows, which means that their financial interest is not in rehabilitation, not in reducing crime, not in returning people to their communities as functioning citizens. Their financial interest is in more prisoners, more beds filled, more days of incarceration per person, more contracts with governments to house more people for longer. The system that began with convict leasing, where private businesses paid the state for prison labour, has evolved into a system where private businesses are paid by the state for prison beds, the relationship between private profit and human incarceration has not ended. It has been formalized. The thread named, because I want to name the thread explicitly, clearly, without ambiguity. The thread runs from the plantation of 1619 through the Middle Passage, the slave codes, the 13th Amendment loophole, the black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, the war on drugs, the 2.3 million, the private prison, to tonight. It does not break. The mechanisms change, the names change, the legal justifications change, the language used to describe what is happening changes. The result does not change. A system that uses the criminal justice apparatus to maintain a racial hierarchy that benefits from the labour and the disenfranchisement of black people. Not an accident, not coincidence, not an unintended consequence of policies designed for other purposes. A system designed, operating as designed. What Michelle Alexander said, because before this chapter closes, I want to give Michelle Alexander the last word. She wrote, "We have not ended racial caste in America. We have simply redesigned it. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have simply redesigned it. The first design was slavery. The second design was Jim Crow. The third design is mass incarceration. 3 designs, 1 system, 1 purpose, 1 result, and the people inside that system tonight are real people with real families, with real names, who were born into a country that had been redesigning their captivity since 1619. What is being done and what still needs doing, because the chapter does not end in darkness, because it never has. The same communities most devastated by mass incarceration are the communities most actively organising against it. The abolition movement, the prison reform movement, the campaigns to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions, the campaigns to end the 13th Amendment loophole entirely. In 2018, Colorado became the first state to remove the exception clause from its state constitution, abolishing slavery completely. Without a loophole, Utah and Nebraska followed in 2020, Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont in 2022. State by state, the loophole that was written into the abolition of slavery is being closed 157 years after the 13th Amendment was ratified. The work of finishing what it promised is still underway. Let the thread settle into the full weight of what it is. 4 words in the abolition of slavery. The black codes immediately. Convict leasing on the same plantations, Angola, named for the country the enslaved people came from, still operating on the same land. Jarvius cotton, 5 generations unable to vote, 5 different reasons, 1 thread, and the loophole, slowly, state by state, being closed. Chapter 11 is waiting. The civil rights movement and what it cost. Rosa Parks, who was not tired from work. She was tired of giving in. Martin Luther King, the Birmingham jail letter. Malcolm X, by any means necessary. The March on Washington. The 4 little girls killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church and the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, what was won and what it cost to win it, but only when you need it. The thread is behind us. The movement is ahead. And Rosa Parks is already on the bus. People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. A 42-year-old seamstress, an NAACP organizer named Rosa Parks, boarded a bus on her way home from work. She sat in the first row of the middle section, the section designated as the coloured section of a Montgomery City bus. As the white section filled, the driver, James F. Blake, ordered the black passengers in Parks's row to give up their seats for white passengers who were standing. The others moved. Rosa Parks did not. What happened next was not accidental, because the story that most people know of Rosa Parks as a tired old woman who spontaneously refused to give up her seat is not the whole story. Rosa Parks was not old. She was 42. Rosa Parks was not acting spontaneously. She was a trained civil rights activist. The secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. She had, just months before, attended a training in nonviolent civil disobedience at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, and the boycott that followed her arrest was not spontaneous either. The Women's Political Council of Montgomery had been planning a bus boycott for over a year. They had been waiting for the right person, the right moment, the right arrest to trigger what they had already organised. Rosa Parks was the right person. December 1st was the right moment, and what followed was not spontaneous. It was the result of years of careful, organised, determined preparation. The Montgomery bus boycott, 381 days, because the arrest of Rosa Parks triggered the Montgomery bus boycott. Within 24 hours, the Women's Political Council had mimeographed and distributed 50,000 leaflets across the city. Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or any place on Monday. Another Negro woman has been arrested and put in jail because she refused to give up her bus seat. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. If you work, take a cab, or share a ride, or walk on Monday, December the 5th, 1955, 90% of Montgomery's black citizens stayed off the buses. They walked, they carpooled, they shared rides in black-owned taxis. They walked, in some cases, 20 miles to work and 20 miles back. And when asked, one elderly black woman, whether her feet were tired, she said, "My soul has been tired for a long time. Now my feet are tired and my soul is resting." The boycott continued for 381 days. Martin Luther King and the movement, because the Montgomery bus boycott produced from relative obscurity the leader who would come to define the civil rights movement to the world. Martin Luther King Jr., 26 years old, the new pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, too new to Montgomery, Rosa Parks later recalled, to have made strong friends or enemies, which made him the ideal choice to lead. He spoke to the mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church on the first night of the boycott to several thousand people and said, "There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time, my friends, when people get tired of being plunged across the abyss of humiliation, where they experience the bleakness of nagging despair. There comes a time," and that time had come. The sit-ins and the freedom riders, because the Montgomery bus boycott was not the only form that the resistance took. On February 1st, 1960, 4 black college students from North Carolina A and T University sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, a lunch counter that served only white customers. They were refused service. They stayed. The next day, more students came, and the next day, more. Within weeks, sit-ins, organised, disciplined, non-violent, had spread to 55 cities in 13 states. Young people trained to sit quietly while people poured ketchup on their heads, burned them with cigarettes, called them every name that the 500-year history of that word had accumulated, and they sat quietly, dignified, refusing to respond with the violence that their tormentors were trying to provoke, because they understood what King understood, that the violence of the system needed to be made visible to the whole country before the whole country could be moved to end it. Birmingham and the fire hoses, because the strategy was deliberate. Make the violence of the system visible, force it into the light, onto the television screens of America. And nowhere was that strategy more deliberately, more consequentially, more devastatingly executed than in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963. Birmingham was known as the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States, so routinely targeted by bombings of black homes and churches that locals called it Bombingham. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chose it deliberately because its Commissioner of Public Safety, a man named Bull Connor, was known to be exactly the kind of person who would respond to non-violent protest with the kind of violence that cameras would capture and the country would not be able to look away from. They were right. Bull Connor turned fire hoses on peaceful demonstrators, children among them. The pressure, so powerful it tore bark from trees and rolled people down the street. He unleashed police dogs on the crowds, and the photographs went around the world. The Birmingham jail and the letter, because King was arrested in Birmingham. On April 12th, 1963, for marching without a permit, he was placed in solitary confinement in a dark cell with no mattress, denied phone calls, an ally, smuggled in a newspaper containing a statement by 8 white Alabama clergymen criticizing King's methods as unwise and untimely. King began writing his response on the newspaper itself, in the margins, then on scraps of paper supplied by a black prisoner, then on paper his lawyers eventually smuggled in. What he wrote is now considered one of the most important documents in American history, the letter from Birmingham jail. He wrote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And he wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, written in the margins of a newspaper in a dark cell without a mattress in Birmingham, Alabama, April 16th, 1963, the March on Washington and the Dream, because the Birmingham campaign and the letter from Birmingham jail and the photographs of the fire hoses and the police dogs combined to produce something that the entire movement had been building toward, political will. President Kennedy, watching the Birmingham footage, called it shameful and introduced civil rights legislation to Congress. And on August 28th, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., in the largest civil rights demonstration in American history, the March on Washington. And at the end of that march, standing in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the speech that the entire movement had been building toward. He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today, what it cost to get there, because the dream cost something, and the chapter would not be honest if it only told the inspirational story without telling what was paid to make it possible." On September the 15th, 1963, 18 days after the March on Washington, 18 days after I Have a Dream, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, planted by members of the Ku Klux Klan. It killed 4 little girls: Addie Mae Collins, 14 years old, Cynthia Wesley, 14 years old, Carol Robertson, 14 years old, Carol Denise McNair, 11 years old. They had been in the basement of the church, changing into their choir robes, 14, 14, 14, and 11. In the basement of a church on a Sunday morning, the dream cost 4 little girls their lives 18 days after it was spoken. Malcolm X and the other voice, because the civil rights movement was not only Martin Luther King. There was another voice, another vision, another understanding of what the situation demanded. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925. His father, a Baptist preacher, killed, possibly by white supremacists. When Malcolm was 6, his mother committed to a psychiatric institution. When he was 13, he spent time in prison, where he discovered the Nation of Islam and transformed himself through reading, through study, through the extraordinary, disciplined, intellectual development of a man who had been given every reason to give up and refused to. He became the most eloquent, most uncompromising, most unflinching voice of black fury in America. He said, "We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary. By any means necessary. Not non-violence as a principle. Not turning the other cheek, the right, to defend yourself. By any means that the situation required. The Civil Rights Act, 1964, because the pressure of the movement, organised, sustained, non-violent, and documented in the photographs that the whole country could not look away from, produced in 1964 the Civil Rights Act, signed by President Lyndon Johnson on July 2nd. It outlawed discrimination based on race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin in employment, in public accommodations, in federally assisted programs. It ended, legally, officially, formally, the system of Jim Crow that had been the legal architecture of white supremacy since 1877, and the following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned the discriminatory practices that had been used to prevent black Americans from voting since the end of Reconstruction, the poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, all of it, finally, legally, prohibited. What was paid for these two documents? Because the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act did not arrive without cost. Medgar Evers, the NAACP Field Secretary in Mississippi, shot in his own driveway in June 1963. The four little girls in Birmingham, September 1963. The three civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, murdered in Mississippi in the summer of 1964 while registering black voters. Jimmy Lee Jackson, shot by a state trooper in Marion, Alabama, February 1965. His death prompting the march from Selma to Montgomery on March the 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, when 600 marchers were beaten by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on camera, watched by the country, and Martin Luther King himself assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968, 5 years after the dream. What the movement produced, beyond the laws, because the civil rights movement produced more than two laws, it produced a shift in the moral consciousness of a nation. Not a complete shift, not a permanent one, not one that has not been contested and partially reversed in the decades since, but a shift. It proved that organised, sustained, non-violent, morally grounded, collective action could move even the most entrenched, most legally protected, most culturally embedded system of oppression in the history of the nation. It proved that what the system had spent 300 years constructing could be, in the space of a decade of extraordinary sacrifice, dismantled. Not perfectly, not completely, not without the new systems of control that emerged to replace the old ones, but dismantled, and the people who dismantled it were not extraordinary people in the sense of being unlike us. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices under extraordinary pressure at extraordinary cost. Let the movement settle into the full weight of what it cost and what it won. Rosa Parks, tired of giving in, 381 days, walking. The four little girls in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church. The letter from Birmingham jail, written in margins of a newspaper in a dark cell. I have a dream. April 4th, 1968. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the dream still not fully realized. The last chapter, the long sleep, what was never taken, what survived the hold of the ship, the plantation, the slave codes, the lynching, the prison, the assassinations, and is still here, tonight, but only when you need it. The movement is behind us, the long sleep is ahead, and the question of what was never taken is waiting to be answered. We have been travelling together tonight from the kingdoms of West Africa before the first ship, through the door of no return, onto the water, into the hold, where the music survived in 16 inches of space, through the legal architecture of slavery, through the word that was built to make people feel less than people, through the resistance that never fully stopped, through emancipation and the betrayal that followed it, through Jim Crow, through the Great Migration and what was built in Harlem and Chicago and Detroit when 6 million people voted with their feet, through the thread from the plantation to the prison, through the civil rights movement and what it cost and what it won and what it left, still unfinished. We have travelled a long way together, and tonight, before you sleep, I want to tell you the most important thing in the entire story, what they could not take, because the entire story that we have covered tonight is, at its deepest, most honest, most carefully examined level, not a story about what was taken. It is a story about what could not be taken. They took the name, the people gave their children secret names that only the family knew. They took the language, the people built new ones in the gaps between the languages that were taken, carrying in the rhythms and syntax of West Africa, the ghost of everything that was suppressed but never silenced. They took the family by law. The people married anyway, jumping the broom in ceremonies of their own making that the law refused to recognize, but that the heart recognized completely. They took the history, the people remembered anyway, in the stories passed from grandparent to grandchild in the dark, when the plantation was quiet. They took the freedom, the people ran, followed the North Star, went back 13 times, never lost a passenger, the music, what it is, and where it came from. Because tonight, I want to name the single most extraordinary, most consequential, most undeniable thing that was never taken. The music, not just as entertainment, not just as culture, as testimony. The music of Black America began in the hold of a slave ship, in 16 inches of space, in chains on the Atlantic Ocean, as mourners and the Payam Mountains had thrown cannabis onto hot stones to be present in the middle of grief. The people in the hold sang to be present in the middle of something that nobody should have had to survive. And the music evolved on the plantation, the spirituals that were worship and communication and memory and defiance all simultaneously, and it travelled just north with 6 million people on the trains of the Great Migration and arrived in Harlem, in Chicago, in Detroit, and became jazz and blues and gospel and soul and funk and hip-hop, every single one of them, rooted in the music that was made in the hold of a ship by people who had every reason to be silent and chose, instead, to sing. What the music did to the world, because the music did not stay within the community that created it. It changed the world. American popular music, in its entirety, is built on the foundation of black musical tradition. There is not a single genre of popular music that exists today in the form it exists today that does not trace its roots directly to the music that came out of the enslaved communities of the American South. Rock and roll, rooted in the blues rooted in the field hollers and the work songs of the plantation. Jazz, the most sophisticated, most complex, most technically demanding musical form the world had seen. Rooted in the spirituals and the call and response of West Africa. Hip-hop, the most commercially dominant musical genre on Earth, right now, tonight. Rooted in the same rhythmic tradition that was carried across the Atlantic in 16 inches of space. A people, stripped of everything, gave the world its music, the language that was built, because the music was not the only thing that was built from what was taken. The language that emerged from the deliberate destruction of African languages on the plantation became one of the most creative, most expressive, most linguistically influential varieties of English in the history of the language, African American Vernacular English. The dialect, born in the gap between what was taken and what survived, has contributed more words and phrases to standard American English than almost any other source. Cool, chill, hip, dig, jam, gig, bling, woke, lit, all of them, from African American Vernacular English, from the language that was built when the original languages were taken. The oppressor tried to take the language. The oppressed built a new one, and the new one ended up shaping the language of the oppressor, the literature that told the truth, because the language produced a literature. Frederick Douglass, who taught himself to read in secret as a child and wrote the autobiography that made it impossible to look away. Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861, the first autobiographical account of slavery from the perspective of an enslaved woman, Webb Du Bois, who gave us double consciousness, two souls, two warring ideals in one dark body, in language that has never been superseded. Langston Hughes, asking, what happens to a dream deferred? Zora Neale Hurston, writing their eyes were watching God in 7 weeks in a kind of love for black life that the world was not ready for. James Baldwin, who wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Toni Morrison, the first black woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, who said, if you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. All of them writing in the language that was built from what was taken. All of them telling a truth that the system that oppressed them never managed to silence. The faith that held everything together, because the music and the language and the literature were not the only things that were never taken the faith, the specific, personal, unextractable relationship with the divine that sustained generation after generation through things that no human being should have to survive. The enslaved people of America took the Christianity that their enslavers used to justify their bondage and transformed it into something the enslavers had not intended, a theology of liberation, a reading of scripture that placed the enslaved people of America in the position of the children of Israel in Egypt, waiting for their Moses, heading toward their promised land, following their North Star, the faith that turned the instrument of oppression into the instrument of resistance, the church that became the center of black community life, black political organization, black cultural preservation, and the launching pad of the civil rights movement itself. What the story is really about, because I want to tell you what I think the full story we have covered tonight is really about. It is not primarily about slavery. It is not primarily about racism. It is not primarily about the systems of oppression that human beings are capable of building and maintaining and defending for centuries. It is primarily about the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible resilience of a people who were subjected to all of those things and survived. Not survived in the sense of merely persisting. Not survived in the sense of hanging on until the worst was over. Survived in the sense of building, creating, making beauty in the middle of terror, making community in the middle of isolation, making music in the middle of silence, making language in the middle of the deliberate destruction of language, making family in the middle of the deliberate destruction of family, making faith in the middle of the deliberate use of faith as a weapon against them. Mansa Musa to Barack Obama, because I want to draw one final line through the whole story. In 1324, Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived, travelled through Cairo on his way to Mecca and crashed the economy through generosity. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. In 1662, 12 words made that bondage hereditary and permanent by law. In 1831, Nat Turner rose in Southampton County and proved the myth of the contented slave was exactly that. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped alone and then went back 13 times. In 1865, slavery was abolished with a 4-word loophole. In 1896, the Supreme Court said 7-1, separate but equal. In 1955, Rosa Parks said, "The only tired I was tired of giving in." In 1963, Martin Luther King wrote the most important letter in American history and in the margins of a newspaper in a dark cell. In 2008, Barack Obama became the 44th President of the United States of America, the direct or indirect descendant of every person who survived every chapter of this story. The line runs. It does not break. And you, wherever this found you, tonight, whatever you know about this story or thought you knew, whatever your relationship to this history is, whether you are inside it or outside it, or somewhere in the complicated middle where most honest people find themselves, when they sit with a story this size, you stayed. Through the kingdoms, and the door, and the ship, and the hold. Through the slave codes, and the word, and the resistance. Through the emancipation that came with a 4-word loophole. Through Jim Crow, and the postcards, and Emmett Till, and his mother, who opened the casket and said, "I want the world to see what they did to my son." Through the Great Migration and what was built in Harlem, and the thread from the plantation to the prison and the movement, and what it cost and what it won, you stayed, and the people who stay with the whole story are the people who cannot pretend they do not know anymore the sleep and what it is for, because we are a sleep channel, and I want to bring the sleep into what this story is actually about. Sleep, in the African tradition, is not merely the absence of waking. It is a reconnection with the ancestors, with the people who came before, with the community that exists, not just in the living, but in everyone who ever lived and whose lives made yours possible. The people who survived the Middle Passage and the plantation and Jim Crow and the prison and every other system designed to break them are, in some real sense, still here in the music, in the language, in the faith, in the literature, in the DNA of every person descended from them, in the culture they created that the whole world now lives inside, whether it knows it or not. Tonight, before you sleep, the 12,000-year story of cannabis is behind us, and the 400-year story of what was done to black people and what they built in response is behind us too, and what remains is the ordinary, extraordinary act of sleeping, which is, in its own way, an act of faith that tomorrow will come, that the work is not finished, but that the rest is necessary, and that the people who rested and dreamed and got up again were the ones who changed everything. What I want to leave you with, because before the sleep comes, I want to leave you with 3 things. The first is Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived, crashing the economy of Egypt through generosity on his way to Mecca in 1324, before the first ship, before the first chain, before any of the systems built to contain and diminish. Hold that image, because that is the beginning of the story, not the ship, not the plantation, the kingdom, the university, the 1,000,000 manuscripts, the 400 cities. The second is Harriet Tubman, who escaped alone and went back 13 times, with a price on her head, with a fractured skull, never lost a passenger. Hold that image, because that is what the human spirit is capable of, under the worst conditions ever designed by other human beings to break it. And the third is the music, made in the hold of a ship, in 16 inches of space, in the dark, in chains, on the Atlantic Ocean, on the way to somewhere terrible, and that music is still playing. Whisper. They tried to take everything. Whisper, whisper. The name. Whisper, whisper. The language. Whisper, whisper. The family. Whisper, whisper. The history. Whisper, whisper. The dignity. Whisper, whisper. The freedom. Whisper, whisper. And they failed. Whisper, whisper. The music is still playing. Whisper, whisper. The language is still being spoken. Whisper, whisper. The stories are still being told. Whisper, whisper, the faith is still being kept. Whisper, whisper, the dream. Whisper, whisper is still. Whisper, whisper, unfinished. Whisper, whisper, and the people. Whisper, whisper, who carry it. Whisper, whisper, are still. Whisper, whisper, here. Whisper. You just spent the night with one of the most important, most painful, most extraordinary stories in human history, and you stayed. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment telling me one thing from tonight you will not forget. And if you are a descendant of the people in this story, I want you to know that the person who made this video sat with your history with complete, total, unqualified respect. The music is still playing. Whisper, good night. Whisper, whisper from the kingdoms. Whisper, whisper from the door. Whisper, whisper from the hold. Whisper, whisper from Harriet Tubman. Whisper, whisper who never lost a passenger. Whisper, whisper from the dream. Whisper, whisper still unfinished. Whisper, whisper good night. Whisper,